dia a todas e todos, mas também uma boa tarde a quem nos ouve de outros fusos horários, especialmente ao professor Christian Danz, da Universidade de Viena, mas também aos nossos colegas que nos assistem e são convidados do professor Danz e também estão em outro fuso horário, como o fuso horário de Viena, que já são 3 da tarde. Eu sou o professor Dr. Fábio Henrique de Abreu, secretário da Associação Paulus Tillich do Brasil e pesquisador de habilitação ou livre docência pela Universidade de Viena. Em nome da Associação Paulus Tillich do Brasil, gostaria de afirmar que é uma alegria receber vocês para mais uma atividade do nosso 26º Seminário em Diálogo com o Pensamento de Paulus Tillich, organizado sob o tema Religião, Ética e Política, Contribuições e Limites do Pensamento de Paulus Tillich para a Contemporaneidade, promovido pela Associação Paulus Tillich do Brasil, realizado pela Universidade Federal da Paraíba pelo seu programa de pós-graduação em Ciências das Religiões, com a organização conjunta também da Universidade Federal do Sergipe e da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, e os grupos de estudos Teosfera e grupo de estudos de pesquisas em filosofia da religião da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, além do patrocínio da editora da Universidade Federal da Paraíba e da editora Recriar. Este ciclo de palestras, que se estende ao longo do mês de dezembro de 2025, reúne pesquisadores do Brasil e do exterior para discutir aspectos fundamentais na obra de Paulus Tillich, sempre em diálogo com a teologia, a filosofia, a sociologia e a teoria crítica. No dia 3 de dezembro, realizamos a conferência de abertura, em que tratei do tema subjetividade, historicidade e normatividade ética, sobre o programa de um socialismo religioso em Paulus Tillich. Essa palestra está disponível online na plataforma do canal da Sociedade Paulus Tillich do Brasil e da Associação Paulus Tillich do Brasil no YouTube. Hoje, 5 de dezembro, damos continuidade ao ciclo com a palestra que será proferida pelo professor Dr. Christian Danz, professor de Teologia Sistemática da Universidade de Viena e meu supervisor na pesquisa de habilitação. A conferência, intitulada Juliette e a Retorção da Moral, Marx Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno e Paulus Tillich sobre a dialética da ética da autonomia de Kant, ou a ética da autonomia kantiana, será apresentada em inglês. Eu realizei a tradução, que será disponibilizada em tela para que nós possamos seguir com a leitura. Antes de passar a palavra ao professor Danz, lembro que, após a exposição, farei uma breve reação, mais com o intuito de situar alguns pontos chaves da palestra e favorecer um diálogo mais amplo, tanto com as pesquisadoras e pesquisadores que participam conosco via StreamYard, quanto com o público que nos acompanha pelo YouTube. Aproveito também para informar a programação das próximas sessões de nosso 26º Seminário em Diálogo com o Pensamento de Paulus Tillich. No dia 11/12, às 7 horas, teremos a palestra com o professor Dr. André Yuri Abijaldi, intitulada A Situação Religiosa do Presente, o Contexto do Debate Político-Teológico entre Paulus Tillich e Emanuel Hirsch. No dia 12 de dezembro, às 7 horas, o professor Dr. Jonas Ross nos dará uma palestra intitulada Finitude, Infinitude e Sentido, Pensar a Religião com Kierkegaard e Tillich. E no dia 15 de dezembro, às 7 horas, também às 7 horas do horário de Brasília, o professor Dr. Pablo Fernando Dumer nos dará uma palestra sobre o conceito de realismo crente em Tillich, Gênese, contexto e desdobramentos. Temos, portanto, praticamente um mês inteiro de diálogo intenso e interdisciplinar em torno da obra de Tillich, suas recepções e interfaces, mas também seus limites. É com grande satisfação, mas também com profunda estima pessoal, que passo agora a apresentar o nosso convidado de hoje, o professor Dr. Christian Danz. Se nossa equipe técnica já puder colocá-lo em tela, seria bom. Passo a apresentação. O professor Christian Danz é professor de Teologia Sistemática na Faculdade de Teologia Protestante da Universidade de Viena. O professor Danz estudou Teologia Protestante na Universidade de Viena de 85 a 90. De 93 a 94, realizou o seu estágio ministerial na Igreja Evangélica Luterana da Turíngia. Em 94, obteve seu doutorado em Teologia. Sua dissertação teve como tema a Cristologia Filosófica de Friedrich Schelling. De 96 a 98, foi bolsista de pós-doutorado da Fundação Alemã de Pesquisa, DFG. De 1998 a 1999, foi assistente de pesquisa na Cátedra de Teologia Sistemática da Universidade de Viena. Em 99, concluiu sua habilitação em Teologia Sistemática na Universidade de Viena. Sua tese de habilitação teve como título A Religião como Consciência da Liberdade, um estudo da teologia como teoria das condições de constituição da subjetividade individual em Paulus Tillich. Desde 99, é professor Privatdozent de Teologia Sistemática na Faculdade de Teologia da Universidade de Viena. De 2000 a 2002, foi professor visitante de Teologia Sistemática na Universidade de Essen. Desde o semestre de verão de 2002, é professor de Teologia Sistemática na Faculdade de Teologia Protestante da Universidade de Viena. Foi ordenado pela Igreja Evangélica Luterana da Turíngia em março de 2002. De 2004 a 2006, foi vice-presidente. E desde 2006 ocupa a presidência da Sociedade Paulus Tillich da Alemanha. Desde 2009 é membro da Comissão para a Publicação dos Escritos de Schelling, da classe filosófico-histórica da Academia de Ciências da Baviera, e também das obras de Paulus Tillich, sob o patrocínio do Fundo de Pesquisa Científica da Áustria, FWF. Cito apenas algumas publicações independentes, como a tese de doutorado em Filosofische Christologie Schellings, de 1996, de novo Religions aus Freiheitsbewusstseins, do ano 2000. Também no ano 2000 publicou um livro intitulado Einführung in die Theologie der Religionen, Introduções à Teologia das Religiões. 2005, Gott und die menschliche Freiheit, Studien zum Gottesbegriff in der Neuzeit, Deus e a Liberdade Humana, estudos sobre os conceitos de Deus na modernidade. Em 2007, publicou o livro Wirken Gottes zur Geschichte eines theologischen Grundbegriffs, Deus efetivo, Deus que atua sobre a história de um conceito teológico fundamental. Em 2008, publicou o livro Die Deutung der Religion in der Kultur, Aufgaben und Probleme der Theologie im Zeitalter des religiösen Pluralismus, o significado, a interpretação da religião na cultura, tarefas e problemas da teologia na era do pluralismo religioso. Em 2010, ele publicou o livro Einführung in die evangelische Dogmatik, 2010, uma introdução à dogmática evangélica. 2013, Grundprobleme der Christologie, problemas fundamentais da cristologia. E também, em 2013, uma introdução à teologia de Martim Lutero, Einführung in die Theologie Martin Luthers, que agora está na sua segunda edição e que acaba de ser publicada. Em 2016, publicou em sua Sistemática Teologia, que também está para ser publicada a segunda versão. E, finalmente, em 2024, um dos últimos livros publicados, exceto a segunda versão da Introdução à Teologia de Martin Lutero, pela Mercer University Press, The Theology of Paulus Tillich, Contexts and Key Issues. Lieber Professor Christian Danz, es ist eine große Freude, Sie nun schon zum dritten Mal in Folge hier begrüßen zu dürfen. Also vielen Dank, dass Sie unserer Einladung gefolgt sind und Ihre wertvollen und aufschlussreichen Forschungsergebnisse mit uns geteilt haben. Es ist uns eine große Ehre, Sie erneut bei uns zu haben. Also vielen Dank nochmal. Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you so much for your huge introduction. Also the list of books is very long, I see it. And thank you for the invitation to your annual meeting of the Brazilian Tillich Society. And it's a great pleasure for me. And thank you for your kind introduction. And especially, most of all, thank you for the translation of my paper from a very, very difficult German into a fluent English. I hope.
Well, there has yes, I hope as well. That has become my expertise, I think.
Yes. As you are a great translator, and the word, the translation and edition process of the book about Tillich is to a great part your job. Thank you so much, and also thank you for all. Okay, if I've frozen, give me a sign. I try to change the room because I live in the old world and not in the new. Maybe the internet is something slower. Okay, let's start. In his contribution on Horkheimer's statement, to save an unconditional meaning without God is vanity, Jürgen Habermas writes, quote, Horkheimer praises the obscure writers of the bourgeoisie for not concealing the impossibility of presenting a fundamental argument against murder from reason, but rather for shouting it out to the world. I confess that this proposition irritates me no less today than it did almost 4 decades ago when I first read it. End of quote. In the quoted passage, Habermas refers to the second excursus of Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialektik of Enlightenment, which is famously dedicated to the literary work of the Marquis de Sade and his protagonist, Juliette. The bourgeois morality of the Enlightenment, whose exemplary form is found in Kant's ethics of autonomy, is revealed in its true consequences by the Marquis, but also by Friedrich Nietzsche. Quote, for Sade, the Enlightenment is not so much an intellectual as a social phenomenon. He purposed the dissolution be overcome by the higher self, the critique of solidarity with society, office, and family to the point of proclaiming anarchy. His work reveals the mythological character of the principles on which, after religion, civilization is based: decalogue, paternal authority, and property. End of quote. The reason established in its autonomy by the Königsberg philosopher is, as the French Enlightenment philosopher de Sade recognized and elaborated in his Chronique Scandaleuse Justine et Juliette, based on pure self-assertion. Autonomous self-determination reveals itself as immediate self-realization. Adorno's, and especially Horkheimer's, relationship to the Kantian ethics of autonomy is not as clear-cut as the line they drew from the Enlightenment via the Marquis to the barbarism of fascism suggests at the first glance. The work of the all-destructor marks a crucial point of reference for the genesis of Horkheimer's critical theory. The genesis of Horkheimer's critical theory sees itself as standing in the tradition of Kantian philosophy and its critical potential. At the same time, however, it is precisely the formalism inscribed in the Kantian concept of reason that excludes any goal-oriented idea in terms of content, of social development ab ovo, and to its instrumental rationality drives it directly into barbarism. This ambiguous relationship to the Enlightenment and to Kantian philosophy in particular is significant for the debates in the first half of the 20th century. Against the backdrop of the crisis of historicism and the explosion of modernity, numerous authors are developing philosophical and theological concepts for overcoming the overall social crisis of orientation. In these debates, Kant's philosophy serves as an important reference point, while at the same time, the formalism of his philosophy is subjected to a radical criticism. Of relevance for the aforementioned controversies about the right way out of the crisis of modernity is, above all, the fact that neo-Kantian and phenomenological motives are combined to form a theory of concrete, historically embedded subjectivity. I need only recall Emil Lask and the young Martin Heidegger. Philosophy is developed here as a performance-based theory of a concrete subject, embedded in historical and social structures and of its self-understanding. This is also reflected in the debates about the Enlightenment. Since the end of the 1920s, Enlightenment no longer functions in discourses about the crisis of modernity as a historiographical epochal term, but as a historical, philosophical, interpretive category for a state of consciousness that needs to be overcome. This roughly outlines the problem historical debate context in which the interpretation of Kant by the protagonists of the Frankfurt School stands, which will be the focus of my subsequent reflections. I begin with the inclusion of the ethics of autonomy in Horkheimer's and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment. Horkheimer's image of Kant will then be examined. I would like to conclude with a few reflections on the critique of autonomous morality by, in German, Paulus Tillich. Firstly, Kant and the Marquis, or Juliette too, loves system and consequence. In their philosophical fragments, first published in hectographed form during the American exile in 1944, and then in Amsterdam in 1947, Horkheimer and Adorno describe in detail and against the framework of Max Weber's investigations on the genesis of the modern society, the ambivalence of the Enlightenment. While the Enlightenment, quote, pursued the goal of removing fear from people and establishing them as masters, the fully enlightened world shines with the sign of triumphant disaster, end of quote. The disenchantment of the world, the replacement of myths with modern rationality remains, however, bound to the mythical structure of the ever-same. The domination of nature by humankind, which already finds its expression in myths, becomes radical in modernity, since the transcendental subject completely subjugates nature by transcendentally constituting it. Through negation, however, the subject remains bound to nature, since it is only in the act of the self-determination and thus self-preservation that the subject is what it is. Therefore, the, quote, world domination over nature turns against the thinking subject itself, end of quote. Of it, however, nothing, quote, remains but that eternal same I think, which must be able to accompany all my representations, end of quote. Because of this dialectic inscribed in abstract self-determination and its destructive consequences, it is crucial that enlightenment enlighten itself. Otherwise, reason destroys itself. This concept of enlightenment is explicated by means of the Kantian ethics of autonomy in the excursus Juliette, or enlightenment, and morality, which goes back to Horkheimer. Kant's famous definition of the enlightenment, to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another, end of quote, reaches its culmination in the work of the Marquis de Sade. His work documents Kant's emphatic concept of independent thought, quote, the bourgeois subject freed from tutelage, end of quote. But how do the gymnastic pyramids of Sade's orgies, end of quote, fit into the trajectory of the Königsberg thinker and his foundation of morality? For Horkheimer and Adorno, this connection results from the Kantian concept of reason, the true consequences of which the Marquis revealed. Let us, therefore, take a closer look at this aspect. Quote, in the Enlightenment sense, thinking is a creation of a unified scientific order and the derivation of factual knowledge from principles, whether these are interpreted as arbitrarily established axioms, innate ideas, or the highest abstractions. End of quote. In Kant's philosophy, the Enlightenment finds its true self insofar as a Königsberg thinker places reason upon itself. Reason is not only distinguished by spontaneity, but rather it is also simultaneously the principle of all knowledge and all actions arising from within itself. The transcendental subject, in a sense, constitutes the stage upon which the empirical eye enters through the mechanism of its categorical forms and systematizes them into the unity of the world. Without its permanent activity, the constitutive acts of the understanding, there is no world for the eye. The true character of the transcendental subject is self-preservation and thus abstract self-determination. At the same time, Kantian reason is purely formal. It operates, therefore, instrumentally. The subject, as transcendental, is freed from all prior authoritarian constraints and left to its own device, but at the cost of subjecting its other to the blind mechanism of its categorical apparatus of understanding. Thus, with the, quote, formalization of reason, theory itself becomes an incomprehensible concept, and thinking is considered meaningful only after the abandonment of meaning, end of quote. According to Horkheimer and Adorno, Kantian theoretical reason is based on the principle of immediate self-determination. Therefore, it is ambivalent and tends toward domination over its other, on which, however, it also becomes dependent via negationes. This has consequences for practical reason. In Kant's work, as in the moral doctrines of the Enlightenment as a whole, it takes the place of the former theological and metaphysical models of order. In the ethics of autonomy, only the will that submits itself to the moral law is considered good and ultimately free. The will determined by reason and the law inherent within it is a good will. Moral self-consciousness, however, is constituted solely through a break with the empirical I, which is affected by inclinations. Inclinations, affects, and all sensory impulses must be subjected to the moral law and consequently placed in moral indifference. Quote, but to Kant, moral forces are no less neutral drives and behaviors than immoral ones, into which they immediately transform when, instead of being directed toward that hidden possibility, namely of the immediate self-determination, they are directed toward reconciliation with power. End of quote. Morality is constituted and realized solely in the form of the rule of the higher faculty of desire over the lower. Due to the formal structure of the moral law, which, as is well known, consists in the mere form of legality, all content-related purpose determinations are excluded from morality. It is realized, at least according to Horkheimer and Adorno, purely formally. However, the same ambivalence is inherent in the formal structure of practical reason as in theoretical reason, since reason, quote, unmasks substantive goals as a power of nature over the mind, as an impairment of its self-legislation. It stands formally as it is, as the disposal of every new natural interest. Thinking becomes entirely an organ. It is reduced to nature, end of quote. For Horkheimer and Adorno, Kantian ethics of autonomy inherently contains a dialectic that ultimately bankrupts it. It is based on the relationship between the transcendental and empirical I, freedom and nature, which Kant was unable to resolve. In doing so, he misjudged the ambivalence and, because it remained unexamined, destructive character of his concept of reason. The Marquis deserves credit for having exposed this dialectic. Juliette, the protagonist of his 1797 work, Histoire de Juliette, loves, quote, system and consequence, end of quote. She, a rationalist like the Königsberger moral philosopher, disregards all sensory determinants of the will and acts consistently according to the formalism of enlightened reason. According to the latter, all affects are equal value, provided that the agent in determining their will should suspend these affections and not consider the consequences of their action. The culturally developed moral codes that stabilize society are indifferent to the formality of the moral law. There is nothing wrong with simply reversing them, all of which are historical relative. This is precisely what Juliette does with the chill of composure of the enlightened rationalist. She proceeds, quote, by no means fanatically, like Catholicism. She merely carries out in an enlightened and bustling manner. She practices the practice of sacrilege that had been in the blood of Catholics since archaic times. The prehistoric behaviors to which civilization had placed a taboo had been transformed into destructive ones under the stigma of bestiality, leading a sectarian existence. Juliette no longer acts upon them as natural, but as taboo. She compensates for the value judgment against them, which was unfounded because all value judgments are unfounded by its opposite. End of quote. Juliette's reversal of morality, according to the authors of the Dialektik of Enlightenment, is based on Kant's moral indifference to the passions. However, the formal rational justification of morality, which is achieved precisely through the elimination of natural inclinations, does not rid nature of itself. Juliette herself bears witness to this. In all her supper enlightenment, she retains a vestige of superstition. Quote, "As soon as we do not believe in God, my dear, I tell you, the profanizations you desire are nothing more than utterly useless childishness. I am perhaps even more steadfast than you. My atheism is at its peak. So do not imagine that I need the childishness you suggest in order to strengthen myself in it. I will commit them because they give you pleasure, but purely for amusement." End of quote. For the enlightened Juliette, sacrilege, sexual orgies, and crime are all purely instrumental acts carried out for their own sake and without regard for the consequences. She derives pleasure from them. However, and through this pleasure binds herself to the other of rational thought, to nature, from which she sought to liberate herself through reason. Due to her formal and thus instrumental concept of reason, as well as a moral indifference of all emotions inextricably linked to it, Juliette represents the consequences of Kantian ethics of autonomy with almost ruthless candor. It is clear that interpreting Juliette as a prototype of an enlightened ethics of reason itself presupposes a specific interpretation of Kantian philosophy. This must now be examined. Secondly, Horkheimer's Kant, or the transcendental I as an ensemble of social relations. The image of Kant presented by the authors of Dialektik of Enlightenment is decidedly ambivalent. However, in the case of Max Horkheimer, it is based on an intensive and continuous engagement with the work of the critical transcendental philosopher. In 1922, the young Horkheimer submitted his dissertation on the antinomy of teleological judgment to his teacher Hans Cornelius. And 3 years later, his habilitation thesis on Kant's critique of judgment as a link between theoretical and practical philosophy. Both dissertations are dedicated to the critique of judgment and inquire into the unity of the Kantian system, more precisely how the mechanism of the categories of understanding corresponds with the teleological concept of the organism. In this context, the critic of practical reason, whose primacy over theoretical reason, Horkheimer asserts, initially recedes noticeably into the background. A similar picture as his doctoral dissertation is presented in his 1925-26 lecture about the German idealistic philosophy. These lectures address Kant under the guiding question of the wissenschaftliche foundation of the metaphysic and present a comprehensive interpretation of his thought. Horkheimer retained fundamental aspects of his early interpretation of Kant, such as a critic of metaphysics and the production theorem in his critical theory of society. However, since the late 1920s, a reinterpretation of the transcendental I and its categorical constitutive functions has taken place. Quote, according to the materialist view, however, Horkheimer writes in the addendum to his programmatic essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, published in 1937, quote, this fundamental activity is social labor, whose class-based form imprints its marks on all human modes of reaction, including theory. End of quote. From this cum grano salis Marxist reformulation of the idealist production theorem, a number of consequences arise, from which Horkheimer's interpretation of Kant becomes comprehensible. These can all be understood as a commentary on or engagement with the Kantian dualism of the transcendental and empirical I, which was already noted in his doctoral dissertation. The interpretation of transcendental consciousness as an expression of social relations of production initially leads to the conclusion that all cultural substance is understood as a superstructure of society's economic structure. Kantian philosophy and his ethics of autonomy thus come into view as an exemplary expression of bourgeois society. Building up this is the insight into the historically mutability of all cultural phenomena, including all a priori assumptions. Since morality is an expression of social forces of production, it too is a historical phenomenon. With the end of the bourgeois era, morality also comes to an end. The thesis of the unjustifiability of morality is thirdly a consequence of the aforementioned convictions. In a certain sense, it applies in the guise of the Marxist superstructure and substructure theorem, the greatest philosopher, namely Schopenhauer, to Kantian ethics. In contrast to traditional theory, critical theory understands itself as theoretical description based on the performative act of the concrete situation, which is always embedded in socio-historical context. Therefore, as a theory, it is simultaneously a practice that urges social change. Horkheimer's interpretation of Kantian ethics, as well as its critique, builds on the aforementioned systematic premises. Because Kant failed to recognize the dependence of the principles of his moral philosophy on their social conditioning, his conception remains aporetic and tends toward ideology. Horkheimer's critique of the Königsberg philosopher's conception thus targets the relationship between the transcendental and empirical I. It must, so to speak, be turned from its idealistic head to its materialistic feet. That this will not be without consequences should be clear. First, Horkheimer's interpretation of the principal theoretical foundation of the ethics of autonomy, as well as its problems, must be addressed, followed by his own reformulation proposal, which transforms theoretical elements of Kantian ethics into an ethics of responsibility. The structural elements of Kantian ethics, that is, the moral law and its application to humans as finite, sensory, rational beings, contain, according to Horkheimer, an internal aporia, which he formulates as a conflict or opposition between acting from duty and acting from interest. The critique thus begins with the problem of realizing pure practical reason. The individual, always embedded in historically developed socio-economic structures and influenced by inclinations, must subordinate their particular will to the general will of the pure moral law. However, according to Horkheimer and Schopenhauer, Kant's version of the application of the moral law to the individual will leaves open not only the question of why the individual will should be subordinate to the general will, but also the question of, quote, how harmony is to be correctly established in the individual case, end of quote. It is precisely this question of the concretization of the ethics of autonomy which leaves the, quote, individual in a certain state of unease and unclarity, end of quote, that Horkheimer interprets, so now going beyond Schopenhauer, as the precise reflection of bourgeois society within the acting individual. In the individual's inner conflict, the external tension, quote, between the free competition of individuals as a means and the existence of society as a whole, as a mediating factor, quote, end of quote, is articulated. Since the order of medieval unity society, which transcended both the particular and the general will, has been dissolved in bourgeois society, it is replaced by the struggle for competition. The harmony between the social whole and individual wills is thus established by a mere natural process. Kant famously attempted to solve the problem of the convergence of individual will submitting to the moral law in the realization of the ethical task with the concept of the church. Horkheimer replaces this with the materialist theory of society, about whose historical foundations he becomes increasingly skeptical. Since the convergence of individual wills with the social whole cannot be achieved by recourse to individual will, the only remaining option is to change those economic structures that underlie bourgeois society. However, this not only fulfills the intention of bourgeois society, but also causes it to disappear, and with it, morality. Quote, bourgeois morality drives the abolition of the very order from which it is both possible and necessary. If people wish to act in such a way that their maxim is fit to become a universal law, they must bring about a world in which this consideration does not remain as questionable as in the case Kant cites, but in which it can actually be applied according to criteria. Society must then be structured in such a way that it can rationally determine its own interest and indeed those of all its members. However, the problems of Kantian ethics of autonomy noted by Horkheimer do not merely lead to their resolution through the transformation of social relations of production. He also puts forward the far-reaching thesis that morality cannot be grounded at all. This conception, too, draws on Kantian motives, but transforms them into a eudemonistic ethics of responsibility. The starting point of Horkheimer's reflections is Kant's opposition between duty and interest, or between the transcendental and empirical I. The inability of pure deontological ethics to establish a stable harmony between the individual and the general will reveals a general problem inherent in all ethical justifications. They cannot be separated from concrete socio-historically determined interests, as is evident not least in the virtue of Juliette. Against the backdrop of the interest determinacy drive nature and the social mediation of all ethical justifications, Horkheimer argues for viewing, quote, morality as an expression of life by specific individuals and understanding it from the conditions of its emergence and decline, end of quote. Horkheimer thus transforms Kantian ethics of autonomy into a self-aware life practice of the socially embedded individual. In doing so, he draws on both Kant's concept of moral feeling and the idea of ultimate purpose in practical reason. Of the latter, the replacement of the moral law with moral feeling brings to the fore the moment of happiness, which is linked to the Kantian idea of an ideal society. The moral feeling, on the other hand, which Horkheimer places at the position of the categorical imperative in the logic of justification, interweaves the individual will with the universal. It is an, quote, an interest that deviates from the natural law and has nothing to do with private appropriation and possession, end of quote. Kant's formula of purpose, according to which man is not merely a means, but always at the same time the end, designates the psychological fact identified by the moral feeling. Horkheimer's concept of moral feeling or interest stands for the socio-cultural embeddedness of the individual. Human life is always already socially mediated. Horkheimer no longer links the awareness of this constitution of individual life, as Kant did, to the entry of the categorical imperative into inclination-affected consciousness, but rather to compassion. It is that effect in which the individual grasps himself in the synthesis of the particular and the universal that is already present for him. In this sense, the dialectic of enlightenment states that, quote, after the formalization of reason, compassion remains, as it were the sensory consciousness of the identity of the universal and the particular as the naturalized mediation, end of quote. The stabilization of moral feeling, however, cannot be achieved through this very act. Horkheimer sees this as a task of politics. The latter must enforce freedom in society. In Horkheimer's critical theory, social theory takes the place of bourgeois morality. Its intentions, however, can no longer be grasped theoretically in terms of validity, but under the conditions of modernity only in terms of affect theory. The latter's intentions, however, can no longer be grasped theoretically in terms of validity, but only in terms of affect theory. Thirdly, epilogue. Dear Paulus, I don't know if you can imagine the joy you gave me with your remarks on reason and self-preservation. End of quote. With these words, Max Horkheimer thanked his former Frankfurt colleague Paul Tillich on August 12, 1942, for his commentary on his essay Reason and Self-Preservation, which appeared in 1942 Festschrift for Walter Benjamin, and which, in a sense, forms the exposé of the dialectic of enlightenment. Tillich, who had decisively helped Horkheimer secure his Frankfurt professorship in 1931 and enabled his assistant, Theodor W. Adorno, to obtain his habilitation on the second attempt, was, as his correspondence with Horkheimer in 1941-1942 reveals, at least conversationally involved in the genesis of dialectic of enlightenment. However, neither this context of debate nor Tillich's position in the genesis of the Frankfurt Schule has yet been sufficiently appreciated by scholars. Expect the new book from Friedrich Schumann about Paul Tillich and the Frankfurt School, which was published in this year. In his remarks on reason and self-preservation, in which Tillich agrees with Horkheimer's diagnosis of the times, he criticizes the, quote, concentrated dictatorial, end of quote, style of Horkheimer's writing, various misunderstandings in the history of philosophy and theology, but also subjects the treatise's central idea to massive criticism. The latter is aimed directly at Horkheimer's transformation of the Kantian concept of reason. Regarding Horkheimer's critic of reason said, quote, at the end of the progress of self-neglecting reason, nothing remains for it but a relapse into barbarism or the beginning of history, end of quote. Tillich remarks, quote, where does the phase come from that the universal mechanism can turn into the beginning of history? Isn't that phase in miracles of the first order, end of quote. Behind Tillich's critique of Horkheimer's argument in reason and self-preservation lies not only a different systematic conception, but also a different interpretation of Kant. Tillich's critique of Kant initially has comparable features to Horkheimer's. It concerns the concretization of the moral law, that is, the question of how the particular and the universal will can be in harmony. However, Tillich solves the problem differently than his Frankfurt colleague. As early as 1910, in his doctoral lecture in Breslau, entitled Freedom as a Philosophical Principle in Fichte, the young Tillich had argued for an expansion of the Kantian concept of freedom in the interest of its more precise definition. Defining freedom as autonomy, that is, subordinating the will to the moral law, leaves it undetermined insofar as only morally determined will can be a free one. For this reason, Tillich supplements Kant's concept of freedom with the definition that it is the power to contradict oneself. Paul Tillich thus views Kant's ethic of autonomy as dialectical, just as Horkheimer and Adorno do. Against the backdrop of the crisis of modernity, connection to Kant's philosophy insofar as it wishes to avoid the formalism of neo-Kantianism is only possible within the conception of a concrete socio-historically embedded theory of subjectivity. Tillich himself's attempt to develop such a program during his time in Frankfurt and later in the United States in the form of an anthropology based on a performative act, which explicitly incorporates Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason. In the passage quoted at the beginning, Jürgen Habermas referred to Horkheimer's appreciation of the obscure writers of the bourgeoisie in the dialectic of enlightenment. His own connection to the motives of Kantian ethics of autonomy in the form of a universalist ethics of discourse, that is, the reformulation of the categorical imperative through discourse, free from domination, remains, of course, affected by the objections that Horkheimer had raised against the Kantian concept of ethics. But this would be an independent topic of discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank für Ihren aufschlussreichen und sehr komplexen Vortrag, Herr Danz.
Thank you for your translation, Fábio. These complex words.
Yes, very, very complex.
Hard.
So I'm gonna try to make a quick reaction to your lecture, just to situate the cancellation of problems and better focus our discussion on the topics that you raised and discussed in your lecture. So first, I would like to begin by thank you, Professor Danz, for an extremely rich and historically sensitive reconstruction of the relationship between Horkheimer, Adorno, and Kant, and for bringing Sade, Tillich, and the broader crisis of modernity discourse into such productive dialogue. The lecture offered both a synoptic narrative and a closed textual argument, and I found the interplay between philosophical genealogy and conceptual analysis especially stimulating. So let me attempt to restate what I take to be its central trajectory. The lecture situated the dialectic of enlightenment within the intellectual context of the early 20th century, a period marked by the collapse of historicism and widespread sense of disorientation regarding the normative foundations of modern society. From this vantage point, Kant's ethics of autonomy becomes a crucial point of reference, not only because it defines enlightenment self-understanding or self-reflexivity, but because it exposes in its very structure tensions that later thinkers would interpret as symptomatic of a deeper crisis of rationality. A central thread of the lecture traced how Horkheimer and Adorno read Kantian autonomy and as the formalization of a type of rational self-legislation that, when abstracted from substantive ends, risks collapsing into a logic of self-preservation. Through this lens, the figure of Juliette in Sade's Histoire de Juliette becomes more than a literary provocation. She is interpreted as a mercilessly consistent practitioner of Kantian moral formalism, stripped of its transcendental guarantees. Her systematic inversion of inherited moral codes reveals, for the Frankfurt thinkers, the latent possibility that a purely formal conception of reason may be appropriated for destructive or nihilistic ends. The lecture then turned to Horkheimer's own development, from his early engagement with Kant's critique of judgment to his later sociologically inflected rereading of the transcendental subject as an ensemble of social relations. This move effectively historicized the a priori and transformed Kant's transcendental I into a socially mediated consciousness, thereby dissolving the sharp distinction between transcendental and empirical viewpoints. Morality in this framework becomes historically unstable, a superstructure that rises and falls with the social order that produces it. Finally, the lecture highlighted Paul Tillich's intervention, a deeply philosophical challenge to Horkheimer, as I see it. Tillich questioned both the conceptual collapse of reason into self-preservation and the quasi-messianic assumption that the breakdown of reason could spontaneously yield a new historical beginning. His alternative conception of freedom, formulated as the power to contradict oneself, offered a way of recovering normativity without reverting to Kantian formalism and without succumbing to sociological reductionism. Taken together, these lines of argument raised, at least for me, a fascinating question. What remains of Kantian autonomy once the transcendental is historicized, formalism is suspected, and normativity itself becomes precarious? So with this as a summary of your lecture, I would like to raise a couple of questions that emerged for me, questions that may deepen our collective analysis in the question and answer session. So the first point is like on the Frankfurt reading of Kant. To what extent does the Frankfurt interpretation depend on an intentionally selective reading of Kant's practical philosophy? That is, can the reduction of autonomy to self-preservation be sustained once we consider the role of the formula of humanity, for instance, in Kant, the concept of respect as a unique moral feeling, and Kant's insistence that rational agents may need to sacrifice their own well-being for moral duty? that's my first question. Is about like Horkheimer interpretation of Kant, which is very problematic, as I remember Birgit Hecke already showed in the Tagung from the Paulus Tillich Society of Germany. On the figure of Juliette as logical conclusion of the categorical imperative, does the link between Kant and Sade function as an argument or as a rhetorical gesture by Horkheimer? Is Juliette truly the result of Kantian autonomy, or is she better understood as a dramatic caricature that reveals what happens when reason is severed from the universality test or its universal character? Third point, on the historicization of the transcendental. If Horkheimer makes the transcendental subject historically contingent, a product of labor and social conditions, can this theory still offer a standpoint from which we would be able to critique society? Doesn't the dissolution of the a priori undermine precisely the universal claims that critical theory wants to preserve? My fourth point is like on the question of normativity and crisis. Tillich suggests that Horkheimer's hope for a historical new beginning is a form of a faith in miracles, which I would subscribe as well. If both Kantian transcendentalism and Frankfurt historicism are insufficient, where exactly should we locate the basis of normativity in a post-Enlightenment, pluralistic world or differentiated society? Where does the question of normativity lie? And my last point is on ethics after autonomy. Is there a viable middle ground between Kant's universalist formalism and the Frankfurt School's diagnosis of instrumental reason and rationality? Can we imagine a concept of autonomy that remains normatively robust while acknowledging the social and historical conditioning of moral agents? So that would be my questions, general questions to your lecture. And thank you very much again for the insightful exposition.
Thank you so much for your 5 questions. Yeah. Every one of the questions needs a whole lecture. I try to give a short answer, and I hope I do not forget your question. Also, you must remain. The first is the interpretation of Kant through the Frankfurt School, through Adorno and Horkheimer. Yes, it is clear. On the one side, you have in the 19th century and also in the 20th century very, very different interpretations of Kant. If you look, for example, in the theological interpretation of Kant by different theologians, they all invent a new Kant. Yeah? But the same takes place in the philosophical interpretation of Kant. Also, the neo-Kantianism is not Kant in a historical sense. Yeah? And also, the 20th century take up Kant, the Kantian philosophy in very different form. Also, I would say they use Kant for her own program, and they give an interpretation of the Kantian philosophy which stands in the context of debates. I mentioned this around 1900, for example, the neo-Kantianism and the critic of formalism aims primarily to the neo-Kantianism. Yeah? It's a different question how it is by Kant and how is Kant able to take up the concrete society. But this difference you can only give through a further interpretation of the Kantian philosophy. Also, shortly, they use Kant for her own program. Yeah? And the same is by Tillich. Yeah? You have also by Tillich, the aim is to overcome the Kantian philosophy, the Kantian formalism, through concrete ethics of love, like Tillich this calls. Yeah? This, I would say, this the direction of the first question. The second was Juliette. Also, I think Juliette is an example in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, because the point is, for the critic of the formalism of the Kantian ethics, you have no content-related aims or goals of the acting. Yeah? And the other point is, you must overcome or must make a break between the sensual inclinations to the others and so on, because this is moral indifferent. Yeah? And exactly this is an example of Juliette. Yeah? In the background, I think, stands the reception or the reading of Hegel in this by Horkheimer and also Adorno, because the Kantian, this is also the critic of Hegel on Kant in the early 19th century, that subject by Kant is very abstract, and the moral difference, moral indifferent are the sensual forms. Yeah? And exactly, and if this is the case, then you can do what you want, yeah? Because on this level. But the point is, you cannot, through the determined negation, die besondere Negation, you cannot overcome that what you are negating, and exactly this example is an example for this is Juliette in the dialectic of enlightenment. She shows, or the novels or books from Desart shows exactly this. The old moral norms are destroyed, and rejects all sensual and also, in this say, passions. What is for Horkheimer important, and if you, the critic is, if you do this, then you can do what you want. The third question you must repeat. I forget it.
On the historicization of the transcendental, if Horkheimer makes the transcendental subject historically contingent, contingents are a product of labor and social conditions, can this theory still offer a standpoint from which we would be able to critique society? So it's a radical historicization of the transcendental, and a departure from the transcendental in direction of a sociologically constructed subject. But then it claims to be universal. It claims universality to its own theory. So how would that historicization or socialization of the standpoint of the criticism be possible when the standpoint from which we criticize society itself is also a social product of society, or is a product of society thinking itself?
Yeah, this is on the one side the historization of the a priori from Kant, or the transcendent. First of all this is dissolved in the 19th century. Yeah? In the middle of the 19th century, all this is dissolved of all the transcendental theories, because they the development of the society, the differentiation of society, and see or the global discourses which arises in the second half of the 20th century, they all dissolve the Kantian philosophy. Yeah? Neo-Kantianism is not a transcendental philosophy in the sense like the Kantian philosophy. I mentioned this before, because Neo-Kantianism is directed only to science and to nothing other. Yeah? And also in the longer run of the 19th century, the a priori from the unchangeable a priori by Kant. In the end, this is a relative a priori by many thinkers in the context of the Neo-Kantian philosophy, for example, Simmel and others. Yeah? So in the long run, this transcendental philosophy of the a priori is dissolved, because if you look to Kant from today, you see this depends from the history, this depends from the society, this depends from social structures. And this is what Horkheimer and also Adorno takes up in her theory. They dissolve eternal norms. Also, the crisis of historism makes clear around 1900 for all thinkers, as for example, Troeltsch, but also others, that there is no transcendental a priori which is unchangeable in our mind. This is always a result. So now you can say, without prepositions, you cannot understand or acknowledge something. Yeah? But this is a very different form. Yeah? This is not an unchangeable thing. You need, for example, always a language and frame for the recognition or for the knowledge of things. The understanding of universality. Yeah? Universality is not a substance which is given. Yeah? Universality arises in the concrete situation. Yeah? And there are always boundaries, limits of this. Okay? And you need a process, I think, of translation of norms, that you have your norms for or criteria for evaluation. Clear? Not all that all norms are historically changeable. Yeah? That all our understanding is the result of diverse and complex developments. This doesn't mean that it is impossible to claim to make a universal claim. You have a debate about what is universal. Okay? In the end, all this would be, and I think you mean this, we are not happy with the Taliban, and you need points of critic. Yeah? And you cannot say, but this is a better hegemonical controversy. Yeah? And it is clear there must be boundaries or limits of what is possible and what is not possible. But this is not founded in, I would say, in a transcendental a priori. Yeah? Also insofern, we have a change. Yeah?
Yeah, so my fourth question, I think we will return to this question of universality and normativity, and because that belongs to the ethical discussion, and I don't know where to ground it if we remove the transcendental basis, but anyways, we can try to find at least some provisory answers. So my first question would be on normativity and the crisis of modernity. So Tillich suggests that Horkheimer's hope for historical new beginning is a form of supernaturalism or faith in miracles, as you wrote in your text and your presentation. But if both Kantian transcendentalism, as you already point out, but also the Frankfurt historicism are insufficient. Where exactly should we locate the basis of normativity in a, I would say, post-Enlightenment society and a pluralistic society or differentiated society? Where would we locate the norm from which we can criticize society? For instance, like just to provoke you a little bit, Niklas Luhmann has this theory of social differentiation. Okay, every subsystem is autopoietic. But I would say that for Luhmann, the norm is the preservation of plurality in itself. It's a universal form that you preserve plurality. So when one subsystem tries to invade other subsystem or colonize other subsystem, you have to claim like the form of plurality and maintain plurality. But I don't see how, even if like there is a intense exchange between Niklas Luhmann and the Frankfurt School, especially with Habermas, how a critical philosophy as such as the Frankfurt School would like base its own concept of normativity, given its radical historicization of the transcendental subject. Do I make myself clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
I hope I get it. Yeah, also first, on this point, is it different between the Frankfurt School and Habermas? Yeah? Because the Frankfurt, Adorno, and also especially Horkheimer, they reject, and also Adorno, universal norms or anthropological foundation. Yeah? Against this, I mentioned this in the end of my lecture, Habermas has an universal ethics, yeah? And he takes up the Kantian ethics and transforms this Kantian ethics of autonomy in universal communication or discourse ethics. Yeah? But this, I think, is problematic because you have the problem in this ethics of the concrete, of the concretization, and also this ethics works with exclusions. Yeah? It works with a very European concept of reason, which excludes all, which is not reason. Yeah? So, Tillich's critic on Horkheimer is also a miracle, or is based on a miracle, because Tillich works with a concept in which the unconditioned is always the basis. This is always there. Yeah? And Tillich, if you want, has not a transcendental, but in a way a transcendental form of a substance which lies all the process on the ground of the process of history. Yeah? And this guarantees the start of a new. Yeah? This is also especially an idea from Tillich in the 30s and 40s after his immigration in the United States. With his immigration in the United States, his religious socialism. In Germany, the religious socialism is a realization of the religious unity of the society. This changed Tillich in the United States, or with the immigration in the United States, and says, no, especially in the 30s, we need a small group, an orden, or like monks, which, but this comes from George. Also he takes up an idea from George and Stefan George, and he says, yeah, this is what makes possible the beginning of history. Yeah? We need a special group. Yeah? But Tillich Tillich's concept, if you want, if tomorrow the world comes to an end, or the history comes to an end, all people die to the same time, and we have people or humans on the next day, they have the same structure with the unconditioned on the ground. This is the same miracle like Horkheimer, yeah? Because this is not historically. Yeah? And if you make this strong, this idea that all ideas, all norms, all truths are a result of a historical development, then you have the problem of normativity, and you need a new foundation. Yeah? And then works, and I think this is what Horkheimer brings to expression in the dialectic of enlightenment in his own ethics of compassion and responsibility. Yeah? Is you need a different form of ethics, yeah? Because we live all the way, all times in a concrete society with structures and normative structures. Yeah? And in this way, we must, but this is all only for a small group. Yeah? You have no universal ethics today. Yeah? The only way to solve the problems is on the level of the law, indifferent to ethics. Yeah? You need, in a way, Horkheimer hints to it. Yeah? You need a democratic society which makes this possible. But if this runs in this way, you have always the problem that the democratic process can go in the very different ways. Yeah? But the problem of the modern society is we have very different fields or systems. Yeah? And they must negotiate her relation every day new, okay? And must find the boundaries of the systems and so on and so on, without a blueprint and without an insight. Okay? And this is what makes the process of the modern society so difficult. Okay? And also from this results the problem of finding a normative basis for a modern society. Yeah.
So if I understood you correctly, you're pointing towards like the legal system as a source for normativity, as a normativity basis for
living together. No. The legal system gives a democratic society the frame for living together with different moral opinions, different moral or ethical understandings of life. But this presupposes the recognition of the others, yeah? Because otherwise this doesn't work. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question would be like on ethics and autonomy. Kant's universalist formalism and the Frankfurt School diagnosis of instrumental rationality or reason, is there a viable middle ground? I think you already pointed like toward a direction, but that would have to be like evaluated as well, like recognition. So recognition, is this like some universal anthropological feature, or is it like a social creation, or does that belong to subjectivity? I don't know. I'm just like raising questions. And if we can, like, or you imagine a concept of autonomy that remains normatively robust, strong, while acknowledging the social and historical conditioning of moral agents. But I think you already like a glance towards an answer to this question as well.
Yeah. Sure, the concept of autonomy has changed in the run from the 18th century, or from Kant's famous definition of autonomy. For Kant, the problem, you see it in the Kantian ethics, autonomy is the submission of the individual will under the general will. Yeah? And this means every time the end of the individual. Yeah? You have no individuality in the Kantian ethics. Yeah? That's the problem. So we have a development first of the autonomy, first of the self, yeah, or the self-understanding of subjectivity, and so on. And all because the change, and this is, I would say, one of the important insights from Luhmann. There is a connection between semantic and social change. Yeah? If there is a social change, the differentiation of society, which is only also a construction. Yeah? This is a construction which we must make for the describing of the process. You need always a frame. Yeah? You can also use a different frame. Yeah? But if you work in this frame, then the differentiation in the late modernity has changed also the understanding of the subject. Yeah? And we have now understanding of the subject as a substance, which comes to itself, which grasps itself. Yeah? This subject is dissolved firstly around 1900. Yeah? The subject is a process of the production called by Tillich decision. Yeah? But in this, Tillich goes out in this decision, the subject grasps itself in its unity and its wholeness. Yeah? 70, or in our times, also the understanding of subject and also of autonomy has changed, because the subject is an ensemble of rules. Yeah? There is no unity. Yeah? The understanding of the self in the process of modernity is not oriented on autonomy. Yeah? Because all norms are every time historically changeable. Yeah? We have, if you think on the great book of Charles Taylor, The Sources of the Self, the Culture of Authenticity, Authentizität, such is the ideas from the people, the generation of the 68, from the hippies, live an authentic life, but this is not our understanding of ourselves. So, insofern, you have, this is a change in autonomy. Yeah? Clear, we have a frame in a democratic state which makes it possible. Yeah? But to live self-determined life, yeah? Determined life. But this means always you must recognize also the other, which has a different understanding of the self. Yeah? And in this way, and this, if you want, is the great idea from Kant and also Hegel and Fichte, the recognition of the other, because every identity works through exclusions. Yeah? Otherwise, you cannot find, cannot constitute an identity of the self. Yeah? And insofar, this works in this way, that every identity works through exclusion. This means you have the identity is not a substance. It is changeable. Yeah? You can exclude, take up in a new determination of the identity, and so on. Yeah? And insofar is maybe the norm or the normative moment to recognition of the different other. Yeah? But the different other is not the image of the I. Yeah? I find not me in the other. The other is different. Yeah? I think this is a problem also by Tillich in his understanding of recognition, and in a way maybe also by Hegel. They find the self finds himself in the other.
Thank you very much, Professor Danz. I would just like to stress that we are going back to recognition, the idea of recognition, also the legal system for like controlling, let's say, or putting like a framework where we can live together in a society, regardless of its differentiation. But also, I would like to stress that recognition without subjectivity would be like unthinkable. But that's a eternal discussion that we have been having, like the both of us, and I don't think there's an agreement. And
yes. I don't reject subjectivity. I only say we must rethink subjectivity under the condition of a very pluralistic society.
Yes. And I also don't want to privatize the word, so I also would like to invite like the questions from our panel. I think we have like at least two questions. I would like to start with Alex Mendes asked, in which sense Kantian ethics contrasts with heteronomy?
Yeah, in which sense is
Yes.
different? Yeah, for Kant lies autonomy only in the submission of the individual will under the general will, as of the law. Yeah? And insofar the human being is only free insofar as it acts in a moral way. Yeah? All others is heteronomy. Yeah? Also, the Kantian philosophy is, or the Kantian philosophy of religion is presupposes the moral consciousness. Yeah? This is you don't need God or religion for the foundation of the moral consciousness, but for Kant, the realization of morality, and this means the application of the pure practical reason to human beings, because human beings are always not only reason, they don't are only reason, they are always sensual people, they have inclinations, they have sympathies, and so on. This is heteronomy for Kant. Yeah? And religion is a realization through human beings, and for this, so Kant, you need religion. Yeah? A God which has no, or a religion which has no moral foundation. This is heteronomy, yeah, for Kant. Yeah? And insofar, there is a great difference between both. Yeah? Kant would say to Horkheimer's reconstruction, this is heteronomy, yeah? Because only autonomy. But you have the problem by Kant, for example, evil acts are not free acts, because every free act is a moral act, and insofar he cannot be evil. Yeah? That means Kant cannot explain evil acts or evil doing. Yeah? And he tried to give an answer to this problem in his book from 1793 about religion into the boundaries of pure reason, but he gives no answer in this book, in the first book about the evil. This doesn't work. This is the problem of the Kantian ethics. Yeah? But there is a clear difference between heteronomy and autonomy. Yeah? Autonomy is only if there is the right conscious, yeah? Gesinnung in German. Yeah? This is all the, you must look on like the famous definition of the categorical imperative. You must work in maxims which could be generalized. Yeah? You must look by every maxim or every ground which motivates you for your acting. Is it possible to generalize this ground? Yeah? This is only a rule for generalization, yeah? And not a content. Every content is heteronomy. Yeah? This is a difference. I hope I could answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much. A question from Professor Eduardo Ross. There's also a question from Michael Hackel, who is like listening to us. So I will start with the question from Professor Ross. What would be Tillich's position regarding the obscure writers of the bourgeoisie mentioned by Habermas?
Also, I would say Tillich would, I think, we have no statement from Tillich about this. Yeah, we can only think about it and can make a suggestion what would he have think about this. But Tillich rejects, and this is the same or is comparable with the Frankfurt School. Tillich rejects the bourgeois society. Yeah? There is a radical critique, and Tillich lives a life in the 20s, which is in the same way like Juliette. Yeah, I would say in this way, he would say, okay, he would think this is fine what they write. Yeah? So Habermas, this is a different place because Habermas votes indeed for or Habermas' critique, which I mentioned at the beginning, and for example in the end of the lecture. I explained this earlier. Habermas works with the universal ethic. The discourse ethic is a transformation of the Kantian moral or ethics of autonomy into an ethics of communication. Yeah? And the communication process, or Habermas works with an understanding of communication, that communication must lead to a unity or to a consens. Yeah? This is the point. No difference is possible. Consens is a decisive one. And insofar, I would say Niklas Luhmann is right in this critique. It is not necessary that we find a consens. Yeah? We can acknowledge that the other has a different opinion or a different understanding, and we must not be all have the same convictions. Yeah? And insofar, but I'm not sure that I get your question right, in the right way.
I think it's correct, and also he goes into giving like some explanations. Well, of course, like you're mentioning the absence of dissent for Habermas, and I think that's a point that at least in Brazil, from the legal point of view, for a former student from Niklas Luhmann would like stress like democracy is not about consent. It's about the guarantee of dissent. That's the absolutely a critique, direct critique against Habermas. But Eduardo Ross, Professor Ross, is also like offering some suggestions, like maybe attempts to overcome Kant's formalism would be like Horkheimer, compassions, ethics of compassion, Till's freedom as possibility to contradict itself, and of course like Habermas' idea of communication that you have like already like mentioned. And then like Eduardo Gross proceeds like Horkheimer's attempt is based on affect, Tillich on risk, Habermas on the possibility of non-distorted communication in a community acting consciously of its own performative behavior. It's a hyper-rationalistic in a way. and Habermas' theory already presupposes the idea of rationality and morality presided the communication act. So the presentation as to approximation Tillich's notion of the possibility of freedom to contradict itself to Habermas' theory. I think Gross is going into this direction, as refers to Tillich's reference to a kind of a performative act as he incorporates Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason. So if you can just like talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a very large question. Yeah. Also, the problem indeed is with the Kantian ethics around 1900, and there is a very broad critic on the formalism of the Kantianism around 1900. And for example, also Max Weber votes for a transformation of the Kantian ethics in an ethics of responsibility, around 1900. You need every time more concreteness in the Kantian ethics, and in this way, I think goes Horkheimer in the right way. For Habermas, this is rejected, if you want, because Habermas ethics aims to a global or so universality which direct takes up the Kantian intentions. But this leads in the end to a consens. And also the transcendental construction of the ideal communication or the ideal discourse, namely free from domination to the discourse must be free from domination. This is only a transcendental presupposition. Also insofern is Tillich with his interpretation, which aims to more concreteness, very close to the interpretation, or is in the near of the interpretation of Horkheimer. But the problem is in the I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture that many thinkers around 1900, Horkheimer, also Heidegger, Tillich, and many others, they work on a theory of a concrete subjectivity. But subjectivity is always general structure, and we have the problem in the name. What it is concrete subjectivity.
But that's also go for the idea of recognition as a general framework for the ethical action. So how do we base recognition for as a criterion for or a horizon for ethical or normativity? If how do we ground it? That's the problem. That's the problem of how are we allowed in a differentiated society, pluralistic society? How do we ground the idea or the presupposition of recognition as a maßstab for the ethical behavior? So it goes back like in a circle. Of course, the subjectivity is a general idea, but then recognition also becomes like a correlate problem. Don't you think?
Yeah. Also, I would say this works only by the foundation or the constitution of the subject and the idea of the, or better to say, not to use such general concepts, but every concept is general, because the identity of the self is constituted through an exclusion. But the excluded is part of their own identity, and insofar you cannot reject this or negate this in an abstract way. Otherwise, you negates yourself. Also, this is in the moment the only thing what I know. Maybe in 100 years I know more. But otherwise I have no. Also, there is no found. But this means you cannot generalize this. Yeah? You must translate this in different cultures, and only in this, because universality is also a concept which is a historical concept, which is established in the 19th century. Yeah? And if you take this up, you must think new about universality. Yeah? And you cannot go out from general norms or general statements, because they work always with exclusions. And in so far, you must try to find a different way for the foundation of universal claims. Yeah? But you must always think on the boundaries or the limits of such universal claims, because there is no universal claim. Yeah? That's the point. Yeah? And exactly clear, we have a very strong debate or worldwide debate about these questions. Yeah? Nobody knows the solution.
Perfect.
In the end, if you don't work in these ways, you have only the force of or power, the immediate self-determination. Yeah? And this is works also. And we see it every day, if you look outside the window.
Yes. It seems that the idea of pluralism has to be maintained, and that works as a critical horizon under which we can observe and maintain differentiation and particularity and difference. I think that's important. But then the idea of pluralism in itself has to be grounded, and then we almost like go full circle, like going back to recognition and subjectivity. And I don't know, we don't have like a clear answer given the pluralistic worldview that predominates now. One question from Michael Hackel. I think it's a very technical one, and that's it regards like more a historical genetic reading from the Dialektik of Enlightenment. So his question is like, Juliette's reversal regarding the issue of instrumentalization is clearly significant for understanding Horkheimer and Adorno. In Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason, the focus is the problem is problematic and instrumentalization of reason, whereas Adorno seems to point his critique in a different direction. Against this background, how might Tillich be situated in the light of this different perspective? I think he's establishing the difference between Horkheimer and Adorno that seems to be very unified in the Dialektik of Enlightenment, but in his reading, that's not the case, or should be evaluated to be in order for us to see if that's the case or not, and where does Tillich locate himself in this problematic?
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Michael, yes.
Michael. In English. Yes, I think Tillich takes this up. He takes up, especially Tillich and Horkheimer. I hope I get your question right. Tillich and Horkheimer, they were very close, also in the process of the writing of the Dialektik of the Enlightenment. And Tillich takes also this critique on the instrumental reason, he takes this up. Yeah? If you look in the systematic theology, volume 1, and the interpretation of the relation between reason and revelation. Here he takes up the Horkheimer's interpretation of the instrumental reason, because this is Tillich's argument, and this is he gives the foundation for this in his own frame. Namely, the unconditioned lies all acts of the consciousness, the ground of all acts of the consciousness. But in modernity, we forget this unconditioned, and insofar we are running blind through the world and works only instrumental. Maybe sometimes the unconditioned reveals himself to us, and then we get a new orientation. Also in this way he takes this up. Yeah? This is different to Horkheimer and Horkheimer's interpretation of the instrumental reason, especially in Eclipse of Reason, in this book, in the small book from the 40s, because Horkheimer doesn't work with such a concept of unconditioned, which is on the foundation, or this is the foundation dimension of the consciousness. Okay? This is Tillich's theological foundation, for all his theology, which is based from this arises. In his descriptions of the modern society, he always uses this frame to say, no, the modern society, especially the bourgeois society, loses her direction, and because they have no aim. Yeah? All aims are instrumental. Make money, for example. Yeah. And this is the counterpart, if you want, to the religious construction, or for the religious socialism. This is the right direction. There is no instrumental reason. I hope I get it.
Well, I think you did.
I'm happy that I did it. But he can say me tomorrow, next week.
Yes. We'll leave the discussion for the Sozietät next week, maybe.
Apropos. Okay. I don't see any other question right now, and also the level of discussion is extremely high, also for translating and so on. So I don't see any further question. But again, I would like to thank you very much in the name of the Brazilian Paul Tillich Association now for your availability and for being with us, trying to restructure our society, but also with your paper, we are aiming at the our next volume of the journal Correlatio of our association and society, and we can we have your paper. I will translate to Portuguese, and because that makes more accessible to our readers and so on, but also in English if that's your preference, but that's up to you as well. But we can talk about that later. Thank you very much, Professor Danz, for your participation. Please stay with us as we finish our section. Let me thank you again. Thank you so much for your work and for all, especially for your engagement for the Paul Tillich Society in Brazil, for the new bringing to life the work of the Paul Tillich Society. It was a pleasure. It would be more pleasure to be in Brazil and not in the very cold Vienna. But thank you. It was a pleasure to discuss with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Danz. Então é isso, nós encerramos mais uma sessão de nosso 26º Seminário em Diálogo com o Pensamento de Paul Tillich. E eu convido a todos e todas que compareçam às nossas próximas conferências no dia 11/12, às 7 horas do horário de Brasília. Somente essa conferência foi transmitida de um horário mais cedo por conta da diferença no fuso horário na Áustria. Então, no dia 11/12, às 7 horas, nós temos uma conferência do professor Dr. André Yuri Abjaldi sobre a situação religiosa do presente, contexto do debate político-teológico entre Paulus Tillich e Emanuel Hirsch. No dia 12/12, às 7 horas também, no horário de Brasília, o professor Dr. Jonas Rose, uma das maiores autoridades no pensamento de Kierkegaard, em nosso contexto, estará conosco, nos dando a honra de sua presença, e com a palestra intitulada Finitude, Infinitude e Sentido, Pensar a Religião com Kierkegaard e Tillich. E, por fim, nós teremos a conferência do professor Dr. Pablo Fernando Dumer, no dia 15 de dezembro, também às 7 horas do horário de Brasília, o conceito de realismo, crente em Tillich, gênese, contexto e desdobramentos. A todos eu agradeço muito pela atenção. Estou olhando aqui no site, não tem mais nenhuma pergunta. But you have many thanks for our audience. People are praising your lecture. People from Argentina, also Viena, and the United States. That's very good, and all over Brazil. So we are a big country. So
great.
That's something
very great. All over the world.
So thank you once again, Professor. That was our pleasure having your lecture and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Então, em nome da Associação Paulus Tillich do Brasil, eu encerro agora essa sessão e desejo a todos vocês um ótimo dia.